So if you're new to this format, essentially what I do is I post a particular set of topics that are all viewer generated. All of my viewers pick what it is that I talk about and they vote. And so for this week, we are going to talk about something that's often controversial, and a lot of people get confused as to what it actually means. So we're going to talk about sex versus gender. Okay, so we're going to talk about genetic sex and biological sex versus gender, because a lot of people just do not understand, and that's okay. So we're going to talk about it and try to clear up some things. So the first thing we need to discuss is that there's a lot of misconceptions that surround sex and gender. They think sex, genetic sex, and biological sex is the same as gender, and it's not. They're two completely different things. So genetic sex determines gender, so that's a misconception, that they think gender is necessarily biological, that you can only be male or female because biology. And they think that XY is always male and XX is always female. And I'm going to explain all of these things because this can get a little bit tricky for individuals, especially when you get into the biology behind it. And it's mostly to do with genetics in regards to that. So we're gonna talk a bit about that. Now, for sex, all right, genetic sex, we have biological sex and we have genetic sex. So there's 3 different types of categories that we associate with genetic sex, and biological sex: female, intersex, and male. All right. Biological sex has to do with hormones, structures, and organs. So sex hormones, sex structures as far as organs. So that's more biological, okay? And then you have genetic sex, which is chromosomal. Now we need to make the distinction. Genetics is not the same as structures. Okay, structures being uterus, do they have one, yes or no? Penis, do they have one, yes or no? Genetic is XX, XY, and lots of other variances. So gender is identity and expression, okay? That's not binary. And sex isn't binary either, as we see there's 3 different categories. So binary being male or female, that's it. Man, woman, that's it. Gender is not binary. It's a social construct, how we kind of organize our lives to a degree based on who we are. There are cultural differences associated with it, and it's not biological. Biology can influence it, but it's not biological 100%. There are many types of gender. Is my audio and video syncing up a bit, or is it weird? Give me feedback and let me know if it's weird. Sometimes it does that, especially with this software. All right. So sex versus gender. So customarily, when we see sex chromosomes, we think XX and XY, and these are little cartoon illustrations of them. Notice the X chromosome is ginormous, and then the Y chromosome is little bitty Y. Okay, good. Yay, sounds good. All right, so women, customarily, on the genetic level, have 2 X chromosomes. All right, and males, on the genetic level, have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Now, the X chromosome is essential for life, and we're going to talk a bit about that here in a minute. But biological, again, is internal, external organs, hormones, and then genetic is the XX, XY, XO, XXY, XXX, XYY. You can have all kinds of different types of chromosomal influences. So let's talk a bit about that. First, let's get into the biological sex. All right, here we have a cartoon. They probably don't really look like this. They're much more fleshy, and these are colors associated with it to kind of help us determine. The male reproductive system tends to have testes and a urethra. It comes out that way. These are the internal structures, and then they have a penis, and women tend to have, a uterus, and then they have a vagina. And so these are associated with biological sex. These are expressions, phenotypic expressions of the genetic code. So this is what's come out of genes. Now we have to understand not everything turns out this way. And I'll talk about that. But this is what most people associate with biological sex, the parts. All right? These are the parts that kind of manifest from our genetic code. But other things kind of, get in the way of that. So we're going to talk a bit about that. So genetic sex, if it's only XX is female and only XY is male, then how do we account for all of these other variations of, XO, XXY, XYY, XXYY? All of these other variations exist, and they do. They're considered what we call intersex. Since it doesn't fall into the binary male or female, we have something called intersex to kind of it's an umbrella term to kind of culminate all of these other variances. Now, in what we would consider normal, and I use that term loosely, I will say standard. In standard reproduction, we have a sperm, we have an egg, they come together, you have a baby. All right? So the sperm determines usually the genetic sex of the child. So if the sperm has an X and the egg has an X, we have a baby together, usually the baby turns out to be female. All right? Now, XX, you tend to develop female parts. XY, you tend to develop male parts. But it doesn't always happen this way. Sometimes a sperm or an egg could be missing a chromosome. Sometimes they have too many of a particular chromosome. That's common, It's not like it's some rare thing that never happens. It actually does happen quite frequently. And I forget the number right off, but I will post that on Twitter along with, my slides on my website and kind of address how common this sort of thing is. That's one thing I left out. I got so much into the biology, I didn't think about the numbers. It's still considered a minority, but still quite prevalent, more so than you would think. All right, so let's talk about chromosomal variation. How does it happen if you have too many chromosomes or not enough chromosomes in a particular sperm and egg, and then you end up with a child that has an extra X, an extra Y, maybe is missing a Y and only has one sex chromosome? Well, what it's called is non-disjunction, and that's a fancy word for something that didn't separate properly. All right? Normally, when you undergo meiosis, this is an example of meiosis of how we go and we make our gametes, all right? You start out with your XX, we'll say this is a woman, all right? Now, one X is supposed to go over here, and one X is supposed to go over here. But what happens sometimes is that both the X's, instead of dividing into two separate eggs, they might stick over in one. That's non-disjunction. So you end up with an egg that doesn't have an X, and then an egg that has two X's. And then a sperm comes along and plugs right into one. Well, if it plugs into an egg that's missing an X, then that's going to be XO. If it plugs into the egg that's got an extra X, that's going to be a triple X chromosome. All right? Well, it can also happen with the Y chromosome. So now this is in the mother where you're dealing with that particular situation. Now let's talk about we're making male gametes. All right. So if we have non-disjunction in a male gamete, it can have an extra Y, an XY, and it could be missing a Y chromosome. So in this case, if that particular sperm that has the XY goes and plugs into one of those X's, one of those eggs, that's going to end up with two X's and a Y. And then if it doesn't have one at all, then it's going to end up with a a zygote that just has a single X chromosome. So what happens here is you have all of these potential variations of having, what happens if you get like an egg that has 2 X's, and then you get a sperm that has an X and a Y, and then those come together, then you have 3 X's and a Y. So these are all potential scenarios that we're looking at, and it can happen. So we have to kind of address that. Now, I will point out, in the situations where you have just the X and no other sex chromosome, that situation, they tend to develop as female because the default genetic sex is female. Okay, that Y chromosome on it, it has essentially genetic coding that just says, don't develop into a girl. That's essentially primarily what is on that Y chromosome. So if that Y chromosome is missing, the genetic sex tends to default to female. Now, what if you have a zygote? I didn't talk about this, so I'm going to talk about this a second. What if you have a fertilized egg that doesn't have an X chromosome at all and it's just a Y? That one dies. You usually lose that when it terminates itself, because that X chromosome is essential for life. So that's why you don't have just Y chromosome people. Okay? You have to have that X chromosome. It is essential for life. So moving on. So we got that so far. Non-disjunction happens, and that's what allows people to have variances in the XY-XX area. Now, this is an important statement right here. Not all men have a penis or XY chromosomes, and not all women have a vagina or uterus or XX chromosomes. So you can have genetic sex that says one thing and develop completely differently. That has actually happened. So your phenotypic expression of breasts and uterus and all of these things can develop even though you have a Y chromosome. So, and I'll talk about that. So all of these secondary sexual structures, that's the fancy word for it, these secondary sexual structures can actually develop completely different from your genetic sex. All right? Okay, so I'm going to switch over. I'm going to shrink me down a little bit so we can kind of look at this. This is all of the different types of they say abnormal chromosomal combination. That just means it doesn't happen in the standard sense of things. So if you have 2 X's and a Y, that's Klinefelter syndrome. If you have an X but no other X or Y, that's Turner. Then you have, sometimes you can have like a bit of a mosaic. Sometimes you can have XO, XY. You may have female or male genitals or a combination of both. You can have, isn't life great? We can have so many different types of people. It's fantastic. So let's talk a bit about a few of these. Now, Turner syndrome, you have the X, but you don't have another X. You tend to develop as female, but you tend to be a bit shorter. They say several body abnormalities. I don't necessarily like that term. Sense of direction and spatial relationships may be different. There can be some mental retardation. Now, that's a clinical term. Some people associate that and use it as a means to degrade other people, and it really shouldn't be that way. It's technically a clinical term, but people misuse it, so I wanted to say that. Now, XYY, that's supernumerary Y syndrome. You have an extra Y. They tend to be tall. That Y chromosome kind of initiates a lot of testosterone, so they tend to be a bit more aggressive associated with that hormone. Then you have triple X syndrome. You tend to look normal as a female, but you tend to be infertile. So there can be an impairment of intelligence in that regard. It's just because that X chromosome has so much information on it, it tends to overload other operating systems in the body. All right. So if you have an extra Y, there is a rainbow of sexuality. Well, we're talking about gender and sex. I'll touch on sexuality in a minute. But the thing is when you have an extra X chromosome, normally what happens when you have a developing fetus, one of those, if it's two X's, if you have like the genetic female, one of those X's are going to shut down because you only need one to survive. That's why guys, they have one X and one Y. That teeny Y just says don't be a girl, but that other X is essential for life. So if you have extra X's, you tend to have more of other things kind of straying off what we would consider the standard path. And because there's so much genetic information, it can cause other types of issues to arise within a person. That's why that seems to be a bit more of stronger symptoms as opposed to having an extra Y. Having an extra Y doesn't do as much overall body type of issues as opposed to an extra X. Oh, rainbow of gender, not sex. That's okay. All right. So, and then you have potentials where there's hermaphroditic type of situations. And we can see that where you have a sperm that has an extra, it has an X or a Y together. So you can, and it can also be a mosaic sometimes. It gets a bit more complicated. So I won't throw all that at you, but just understand variances in genetic chromosomes can affect phenotypic expression in secondary sex structures. So let me go to the next slide here, if I can. Hit the wrong button. Now I'm going to make myself a bit bigger. Woo, that's always fun to do. All right, so now let's look at hormonal variations, okay? So let's say you had the standard practice of the sperm and the egg. They come together. The sperm had a Y, the egg had an X. Boom, XY. You're like genetically male. All right, well, something can happen called androgen insensitivity. Who knew? Androgen sensitivity is a thing. And what that means, you remember I said the default is female, and on that Y, that little bitty Y is don't be a girl. Well, what happens if your cells don't recognize the testosterone? Because that Y is needed for that up production of testosterone. It's like, we're going to be a boy. And then they start blasting your cells with testosterone to encourage it to develop in male parts. But what happens if your cells don't recognize the testosterone? They're going to continue to develop as female. That's full androgen insensitivity. So there are women who develop as women. They have internal testes that are undistended. They have, a female body shape. They have breasts. They have everything that you would associate with a woman, but they're genetically male. And the thing is their cells just didn't recognize the testosterone. And so genetically male does not mean man. It could mean I'm genetically male, but I'm a woman, and they may very well identify as that. And there's a partial androgen insensitivity. We all start out as girls. Yeah, you do kind of start out as girls, and then what happens is that Y chromosome kicks in, and then it starts to say, okay, we're going to stop the development of women as a female, and we're going to start growing male parts. And what happens with androgen insensitivity, it kind of starts to go that way. But that X chromosome, if not all of the cells are recognizing testosterone, it kind of just stops. It doesn't go any further because it can't go further in the process. And so the default is female. And so a person will then grow secondary structures as a woman. All right. And so we've got to understand the biology on this. There is a spectrum of people that fall into all kinds of various, different scenarios. And there's so many, we just kind of use that blanket term intersex because so many people associate XX as female, XY as male. All of these other and there's a big old balloon of variances. We call that intersex because there's just so many. So that's just kind of how that works. Let's look at gender now. Okay, so we've talked about sex as far as biological and genetic. So you could have an XY chromosome. Hello! You have an XY chromosome set, be genetically male, but biologically develop as a female and have male parts and consider yourself a woman. So let's talk about gender. Hello. So gender is not binary. Binary means male, female, that's it. That doesn't really work with gender. It's based on a social construct. So we often see the male, female standard things. You know, you can go to a store and you see, here's the boy clothes and here's the girl clothes. Here's the boy toys, here's the girl toys. Here's the women's department, here's the men's department. That's binary. This is more socially ascribed, yes. And so people kind of tend to categorize others and categorize themselves into, are you a man or a woman? Well, it's not really that simple. You know, we have people of all different shapes and sizes, and we have people that have all kinds of different genetics going on, especially in the sex chromosomes. And they can develop in all kinds of different ways. Why in the world would we think that everything has to be this one or this one? That's the problem. What? Okay. I don't understand that one. I didn't understand what he was saying there, so I'm going to keep going. All right, but if you have questions, hit me up with questions, and I will answer them as I go. All right, so let's talk about identity and physical expression. How you identify yourself in your mind. That's kind of what gender is, how you identify yourself. And then you have your physical expression, how you prefer to dress and how you feel like you present yourself, and also how you see other people. And so this is kind of what gender is. So we're going to talk about the different types of gender now. So I want to make sure that we're following along. Gender can be several different things. So essentially, when we're looking at gender, we're talking about several different categories. And some of these are blanket terms. So genderqueer is a blanket umbrella term that describes non-normative genders like gender fluid and agender. All right. So agender means they don't prescribe to any particular gender. They don't feel like they have a gender. All right. Gender neutral. That's not easily categorized as masculine or feminine and can be combos of the two. So they don't really say, well, I'm totally male, I'm totally female. They don't really categorize themselves or one another. They're kind of like maybe combinations of both. Alrighty. So anyway, we're moving on to non-binary. So non-binary means gender outside of a male or female. So they don't prescribe to any particular gender and they feel like they're a completely different one. So that's kind of similar to agender, but agender, they just don't identify with a gender whatsoever. Non-binary means they feel like they're something else. All right, and maybe they're trying to figure out what that is. Gender fluid means they are, their gender fluctuates. So sometimes they feel like they're male, and sometimes they feel like they're female, you know, and it can change, and that's okay. Transgender, that's where your prescribed sex doesn't match up with who you feel like you are, all right? So the sex doesn't match the gender, and so you may be a genetic female and have developed genetic, physically as female, but you feel like you're male, all right? So that's transgender. And cisgender means the sex and the gender matches. All right. My genetic sex is female for me, and my physiological and phenotypic expression is female, and I identify as female, as a woman. I'm cisgender. And so that's how that kind of goes. So those are the different types of genders. let's go on to the next one. All right, and these are all the different symbols. So we have so many different symbols associated with gender. It's not just strictly male and female, and these words are kind of small to see, but you can look up these particular symbols and find them and see what they mean individually. So there's I have a diagram here of sex, sexuality, and gender. So we have intersex again, just kind of going back over what I've covered, and then you have female, and then you have male, and then you have gender identity, where you have cis woman, cis man, and then you have the variances in between, and then you have gender expression, where you have female or masculine, and then you have feminine, and you have androgynous. And so you can have any particular combination of these of how you feel you express yourself in your perception of gender. And then there's also a whole set of sexual orientation. You can have a varying degree of that as well. So people are meant to be different. All right, so I'm going to touch on the societal issues associated with sex versus gender. So non-cisgender, all right, non-traditional sense of what we see as sex and gender. Some see it as wrong or lesser. And some non-cisgenders are not seen as really a man or a woman, and that can be problematic. Oftentimes, non-cisgenders are gravely misunderstood. They don't understand that there can be a spectrum, a bunch of variances. They see some of these cisgenders as broken, and they also see it as a choice. But gender can be influenced by your biology, but it can be also coupled with experiences in your life. It is not so black and white. It has a whole bunch of different influences. And it's not really a choice per se. It is who you feel you are as a person. And so when you try to think about it, if you're of like the cisgender, try to kind of put it in, have you ever tried to be somebody you're not? It's miserable. So trying to put yourself into a particular category that you feel that you don't identify with can be very problematic, and it can make you miserable. So I'm going to talk a second about depression and anxiety in gender minorities. Okay, so anything that's not cisgender, all right? And there's studies that show that there is a high level of depression in adolescence in regards to that time where they start to develop more of their secondary structures. So what they're doing is they're studying more and more about this. Now, the discrimination that we actively see in our society could play a role in depression and anxiety associated with non-cisgenders. And it's seen not only in society, but it has also been in science. There are not enough studies inclusive of the various gender identities that fall within this minority. And so the studies that I've seen, they're changing that. Science is growing in this field. And there have been studies that have done like a review of other depression and anxiety type of studies that have left out non-cisgenders. So this is slowly changing. Science is moving towards studying this a bit better. And so science is growing in this field and correcting a lot of this. So that's good news. So what can we do? What can we do in regards to sex versus gender? Well, it's pretty easy. Just respect people. Respect people's gender. If you're not certain, ask what pronouns they prefer. Sometimes they'll just tell you. All right. So people who are part of non-cis minorities, or the gender minorities, they'll usually just tell you which pronouns they prefer. And understand that people are supposed to be different. We're supposed to be different. We're not supposed to be the same. And we should recognize that there are variances, and there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean somebody's wrong or broken. It just means they're different. And that's okay. Allow people to be who they are, because you know what? Kindness is free. Kindness is free. I would hate to have to try to be something I'm not. That would make me miserable. And I've tried to be something I'm not before, and I was very, very sad. And so I can't imagine feeling like you're somebody else and being forced into a particular identity that's not who you are. So kindness is free, and we need to support each other. We're all humans, right? So I'm just kind of wrapping up everything. So the difference between sex versus gender, all right? Sex is female, intersex, and male. It's biological and genetic, all right? And you're not always going to grow secondary sexual structures that match your genes. They can be different too. That's okay. And so gender is how we identify ourselves, how we identify other people, and how we express ourselves. It's not binary. It's whole spectrum and a lot of different things. We have cultural differences. It's not biological, but biology can play a role in who you feel you are as a person. We can't rule that out, but it's not exclusively that either. And there are many types, which, spice of life. It's variety. And so these are all my sources, and I'll post them up, and I can get you more information if you want, but this is what they look like. I've gone a lot through the Psychology Today, the APA, PsychNet, Science Direct has a great article associated with adolescence and depression, especially in gender minorities. And so you can take a look at that, and I'll post these on my website where you'll have access to them. I'll also post this video on YouTube. You might be watching on YouTube a bit later anyway, so that's okay. And so I want to take a moment and thank all of my patrons. And I have picked up some new patrons. I've picked up Tristan and Zachary, and I've also picked up Mark. And so I have Tony, somebody who's anonymous, Mark, Jen, Carl, Anthony, Paula, Zachary, Patrick, Tony, Tristan, and Jennifer. This is my only job right now, and because of my patrons, I'm able to give higher quality types of broadcasts. I'm able to do this more often. I'm also able to spend more time working on this, as well as develop even more educator resources for individuals who need it in their classrooms. And so my Patreon starts at $1 a month, and I have an audio podcast that you also have access to. And so you can find me everywhere on the internet, Scientist Mel. And my website, scientistmel.com, will be up and running next week. And I will host my podcast there as well. Right now, my podcast is on Patreon. My patrons get a week early access on that. Episode 2 is up right now, where I talk about the scientific method and how to read a scientific paper. You can find me anywhere. If you have questions at all, at any point in time, hit me up on my hashtag, HeyScientistMel, and I can answer them for you. Gender is gravely misunderstood, as is sex and in regards to genetic and biological, and there's variances. And we all have a place for one another in this world, kindness is free. Let's kind of recognize that. So, that concludes the science of sex versus gender. And like I said, if you have any questions, hit me up here. If you can, support me on Patreon. That helps me out a lot. Ooh, wrong one. I slipped the wrong one. But you can check me out there. Then you got caught up in work. It's okay. I leave my periscopes up forever, and I also post these on YouTube. If you prefer YouTube, you can check me out there. And if you have any questions, hit me up on Twitter, HeyScientistMel, with the hashtag. This is, a very complicated type of topic, and if you have any questions in regards to genetics, awesome, yay. Message me, because I used to do genetics research as well, and I can talk to you a bit about that if you have questions associated with that. So, that has been the science of sex versus gender. This is cool, and this is fun for me, so, hit me up on Twitter. If you find a study that you need help breaking apart to try to understand, I'm happy to do that as well. So you guys have an awesome day, and I will see you around. Squishy science hugs. Bye.